Roleplay is one of the most powerful English teaching methods when done right, but if you get it wrong, it can turn very awkward or into a chaotic mess. I'm Will from Enchanted ESL, and in this video I'll explain the do's and the don'ts of roleplay. I use this method all the time and I love it, but I've also learned the hard way some of the common pitfalls. If you're not sure exactly what roleplay is or why you should use it at all, then I explain everything in a video which is up there and down in the description. In brief, it's the improvised acting out of a scenario where students take on specific roles. It's not scripted and there's no required endpoint. The idea is to encourage spontaneous speaking. Getting it right depends on finding a balance. There's a sweet spot between forced, stifled discomfort and wild, unstructured nonsense. So many of the do's and don'ts in this video come in pairs, guiding you into the middle ground between those two extremes. The first do is go over a few key words or phrases before each scenario. Most of these should be familiar words. Don't add in lots of new ones. And get your students to brainstorm them as well. 3 or 4 is plenty, and have them visible at all times, ideally on the board. On the other side of things, don't over-prepare. Scenarios are meant to be spontaneous, not the parroting of pre-written lines. Give students the agency to use their own language and take the scenarios in the direction they want, rather than following a script. And during the scenarios, do support your students with language when they ask for it. It's normal that they come across a situation where they need a word and they don't know it, so you should be available to provide it for them. But definitely do not correct them mid-flow. This will immediately knock their confidence and disrupt the rhythm of the whole scenario. Listen carefully and assess them, and then you can go over any language problems later. And talking about teacher intervention, do sometimes intervene to develop the scenarios. If students aren't sure where to go and the situation has stalled, give them a prompt to move it forward. Switch up the situation and see how they react. But don't try to control where they're going. Let them figure that out themselves. And definitely don't insert yourself as a main character in the situation. They'll just get you to speak all the time. To avoid situations where students don't know what to do, have clearly defined roles with a need or a want. I find the best roles have a shared goal or even a conflicting goal, because then there's a clear problem to solve. But don't make the roles overly detailed. All you need is the relationship with the other role and what each role wants. Here is an example of what I mean. Everybody knows who they are, where they are, and what they want. And like this example of the fly in the soup, do use engaging and silly scenarios, especially with kids. Add a twist to standard situations and make them personal for your students. However, don't allow students to make them so nonsensical that they lose all focus. You'd be surprised how many scenarios I've done with kids that just randomly turn into gunfights. The best way of avoiding things getting out of control is with expectations. From the outset, do make it very clear what is acceptable behaviour and what isn't. And with kids, remind them every time you do roleplay in your class. On the flip side, don't force shy students to do things that they really don't feel comfortable doing. Not everybody likes to rush about and do silly things all the time. Adults particularly need a bit of prompting to get them involved, but don't push them too hard, otherwise you'll overload them. Do model how to do scenarios. This is a great way of explaining to them how to do roleplay, because you shouldn't assume they know what it is. Plus, if you're willing to act it out and be spontaneous in front of them, then they're more likely to do it in front of you. But don't expect them to all do it perfectly. It's quite difficult. There's a whole lot of things going on in the mind, so it might take a few sessions to get them used to it. Do encourage the use of movement and props. Kids do this naturally. I was very surprised when I started doing roleplay that I thought a scenario would be perfect sitting down at a table, but the kids just stood up and walked about doing it at the same time. And that's fine. However, don't let the acting become more important than the speaking itself. Some students quickly find it much easier to mime things or just mess about rather than talking in English, which is more of a challenge. If you see this happening, remind them of the expectations. Do split students into pairs, and if you have an odd number, you'll have 1 3. 2 is the perfect number, 3 is okay, but 4 isn't great. And if you have an individual student, obviously you'll need to be the other role. And finally, don't get students to perform their role plays in front of the rest of the class. There are 2 reasons for this. First, most students will hate it. Sure, some students will beg you to do that, but while they're doing that, the other students aren't really gaining anything. The second problem is if there's the expectation of a performance, they'll treat it more like a dramatization rather than a spontaneous roleplay. They'll prepare and script everything, and that's not the aim of what we're doing here. That's not to say scripting is a bad thing. Sometimes you might want to use dramatization and scripting because it practices a different set of skills. And you can find out how to use dramatization in your English classes in this video right here. But for now, I've been Will from Enchanted ESL, wishing you all the joy and success in your teaching. See ya!